Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sheila's Social Studies. Today we're going to be talking about two very specific presidents of the civil rights movement of the 50s, the 60s, and 70s. So, presidents and civil rights. Here we go. The United States was embroiled in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and President Eisenhower was finishing his second term as president, warning Americans of the military-industrial complex and its possible involvement in an arms race with the communist country. Civil rights protests are springing up across the nation, and young men and women are suffering beatings by the hands of Jim Crow. The year is 1960, and the nation needed to elect a president who would be firm with the Soviets abroad and domestically a supporter of civil rights. The race is set. The Republicans put forth Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon of California. Nixon was only 47 years old, slightly younger than most presidents were when they were elected, but what really made American voters feel secure about Nixon was that he had government experience, serving 8 years in the role of vice president. Nixon was hard around the edges in policy and looks. The Democrats selected a young senator from Massachusetts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The Kennedy family was well known to Americans, and Senator Kennedy served in the Senate for nearly 7 years. What went well for Kennedy was that he was younger than Nixon, 43 years old, and he had a calm demeanor, confident, and many would say, handsome. This election would send the United States forward with a president finally born in the 1900s. Kennedy had a family name and power behind him. What he didn't have was the right religious affiliation. Like most Irish Americans, he was Irish Catholic, which meant that if he won, he would be the first Catholic American president. As we discussed before, the last Catholic to run for president was Al Smith from New York, who was blown out by Herbert Hoover in the last election of the Roaring Twenties. It was a hard-fought race on both sides, which included the first televised presidential debates on live black and white TV. Many say that it was these debates that pushed Kennedy ahead of Nixon in the polls. While Kennedy wore a shard, dark, contrasting suit, Nixon wore a light one that made him really blend into the background. Kennedy was cool, calm, and collected, confident in what he was saying, while Nixon seemed distraught, angry, and sometimes sweating uncontrollably. When American voters went to the polls, Kennedy won the Electoral College vote handedly, but won the popular vote by only 118,000 votes. So President Kennedy would enter the presidency with more glamour and power than any other president in American history. This brief moment of lights, fun, happiness, success, and Ritz was called Camelot. John and his wife Jackie Kennedy were the unofficial Prince and Princess of America, loved by so many and full of hope and determination. Young Americans became more outspoken and positive about the change that could happen in the United States. When Kennedy gave his inauguration speech to the nation, he challenged American citizens to ask not what your country could do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Kennedy believed in a new frontier, and in his acceptance speech, called the New Frontier speech, he said to the American people, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, a frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. Beyond that frontier are uncharted areas of science and space, unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered problems of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus. I'm asking each of you to be pioneers towards that new frontier." This speech was so popular that the name of his domestic program became known as the New Frontier. Kennedy proposed many liberal programs for the United States. In order to help the economy, first, Nixon signed legislation that raised the minimum wage and included an extension in coverage and a series of tax cuts that would stimulate growth. Secondly, Kennedy approved programs that would help the poor and unemployed by expanding unemployment and welfare benefits, redeveloping distressed areas like ghettos and slums, and aiding the children of the unemployed. Third, he approved laws and provided over $175 million to aid public education. And finally, President Kennedy supported a new spending expansion of the military and the space program, NASA. The United States and the Soviet Union became embroiled in a rush to become the lone superpower in the world. In attempts to dominate each other militarily and technologically, the two nations became involved in an arms race. Who could create more nuclear weapons? And the space race began. Who would be the first in space? First to navigate the globe, the first on the moon? Kennedy was determined that the United States should be number one and appropriated billions of dollars to the space race. Unfortunately for Kennedy, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. Soviets won, Americans 0. Americans became disillusioned when on April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union sent Yuri Gagarin, a Russian pilot and cosmonaut, into outer space in his capsule Vostok 1. Gagarin completed one Earth orbit in just over 100 minutes. Soviets 2, Americans 0. The United States was not able to go first, but they were not far behind, sending a man into orbit when on May 5th, 1961, American Alan Shepard was launched into space, and on February 20th, 1962, John Glenn orbited the Earth in Friendship 7. Kennedy was never able to see the American accomplishments set forth upon his space race goal of sending a man to the moon when in 1969, American Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. Finally, the Americans won one against the Soviets. Kennedy also supported the civil rights movement. He proposed a civil rights bill that would be supported by Martin Luther King Jr. and James Meredith's enrollment at the University of Mississippi, and in 1961 supported the Freedom Riders who fought against segregation in interstate travel. Kennedy briefly condoned the riders for being unpatriotic, but that may have been an attempt to sway the Soviets into believing there was more support in America for the movement, but ultimately Kennedy supported and forced the desegregation on interstate buses and at the terminal. Unfortunately for America, on November 22, 1963, Camelot lost its crown prince. On that fateful day, President Kennedy, his wife Jacqueline, and Texas Governor John Connally were traveling in an open motorcade through Dallas, Texas. It was a beautiful day, and Kennedy wanted to wave to the crowds of the state of which Kennedy's Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson hailed from. As the motorcade moved through Dealey Plaza, shots rang out. Kennedy immediately grabbed his neck, and seconds later, the infamous frame 313 of the Zapruder film, Kennedy is shot and his head is flung back, ending the president's life. The assassin was an avowed communist named Lee Harvey Oswald. He shot a rifle from a window in the Texas School Book Depository and ran down to catch a movie and a soda. He was arrested and put into prison. So many questions needed to be answered. Was it the Soviets, the CIA, the mob? And Oswald was the only man who could answer them. Unfortunately, 2 days after his arrest, Oswald was killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby when the prisoner was supposed to be transferred. Now, the world would never have any answers. There were so many problems in the autopsy and so many irregularities in Kennedy's assassination. Did Oswald act alone? Was the mob behind the murder? Was there multiple shooters since Kennedy was shot twice? Was a shot from a grassy knoll on the street? Was there a magic bullet? Questions that will remain unanswered forever. Immediately after Kennedy was assassinated, his vice president Lyndon Baines Johnson swore in as the next president of the United States. Now, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson were two physically different men. Kennedy was smaller in stature and thin, young, and handsome. Johnson was large, older, and rough around the edges, but very forceful and smart. As president, Johnson vowed to continue Kennedy's unfinished work and would go on to produce the most liberal domestic plan that helped Americans since President Roosevelt's New Deal. Johnson called his domestic plan the Great Society. Johnson was thrust into office only 11 months before the next election and wanted to prove to the nation that he was worth a re-election bid. Remember the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy asked Congress to write that was supported by Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, on July 2, 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, which banned discrimination based on race and gender in employment and ending segregation in all public facilities. That same year, Johnson signed the Economic Opportunity Act that attacked the roots of poverty. Johnson was making great strides for his bid for winning his own election. In November of 1964, President Johnson overwhelmingly beat the Republican candidate Barry Goldwater, carrying 44 of the 50 states and winning with over 61% of the popular vote. It was time for Johnson to continue his attack on poverty. In the summer of 1965, Johnson created the Head Start program, which provided local schools with over $1 billion to help students by providing preschool children of low-income families with a comprehensive program to meet their emotional, social, health, nutritional, and psychological needs. President Johnson planned a program of reform efforts to have a war on poverty, which he called the Great Society. Johnson's plan included, but was not limited to, Medicare and Medicaid to help some seniors, and low-income citizens afforded health care. He created the Department of Housing and Urban Development to help low-income families get better housing opportunities. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act provided major funding for American public schools. Johnson eliminated immigration quotas and saved millions of acres of land. One of the most influential laws passed was the Voting Rights Act, which banned literacy tests and other discriminatory methods of denying suffrage to African Americans. Since Johnson was so forceful and intimidating, Congress quickly passed most of Johnson's legislation. The president believed that he may be ready to seek a re-election bid until the events in a small country in Southeast Asia would derail all of his upcoming plans for re-election and would put his great society in serious danger. The Vietnam War would put the brakes on any liberal legislation that Johnson had planned to help Americans in need, ending the Great Society. All right, guys, we'll see you next time on Selah Social Studies.